everyone, and welcome to the April Historic Ag Reserve Properties presentation with Kenny Sholes. Kenny's a longtime Poolesville resident who enjoys exploring Ag Reserve history and serves as a board member for the Montgomery Countryside Alliance. Please remain muted during the presentation unless Kenny says otherwise, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. And feel free to post your questions in the chat if you feel more comfortable doing that, and we will go ahead and read them for you. So Kenny, you can start whenever you're ready.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Kelly. And thanks to everybody for being here. It's good to be with you all again. Looks like a lot of familiar faces, which is always nice. But in case anybody is new with us or on the recording, Kenny Sholes, I live here in Poolesville, kind of a amateur historian, I suppose, mostly focused over the last few years on exploring historic homes here throughout the Ag Reserve. There's a bunch of amazing old places, and I'll talk at the end of the presentation about an upcoming historic home tour that we're going to do on the 20th of May that I hope you all will join. But tonight I'm gonna take a little bit of a detour and talk about the Metropolitan Line of the B&O Railroad. And I'll tell you up front, I am by no means an expert on this topic, but it is the 150th anniversary of the Metropolitan Line of the B&O Railroad starting service. It actually really this month in April of 1873, it was really completed. And so it does seem like a pretty appropriate time to talk about it. Like I said, I didn't really know much about the Metropolitan Line prior to about 2 months ago when Gene actually sent me a note and said, hey, it's the 150th anniversary. You should really consider maybe doing something related to the railroad here. And I thought that makes a lot of sense. I don't know anything about it, but maybe I should look into it. And I've lived in the Ag Reserve for most of my life. I've passed under the railroad tracks in Dickerson and Boyd's and Barnesville, actually in Selman, I guess, just south of Barnesville, multiple times. But never really gave it much of a thought, never really kind of considered the significance of it, the history of it, the importance of the railroad to the Ag Reserve and to the larger county. And so, taking some time really over the last month, digging into it a little bit has been eye-opening for me. And actually, I feel like I've learned a lot. And it's helped me put into context a little bit more about some of the old homes and some of the people that I've talked about with you all many times prior. So what I wanted to do tonight was really just provide a bit of an overview of my understanding of the history of this Metropolitan Line, and I'll explain what that is in a second. Talk about I like to dig into some of the maybe specific kind of interesting aspects, at least aspects that I find interesting of the line through the Ag Reserve. And then at the end, if there are questions, more than happy to attempt to answer them. And if I can't answer them, luckily there is a whole crew of B&O experts that I've started to become acquainted with over the last month. So I can certainly get you answers quickly if you have questions that I can't figure out on my own. So I always like to start these types of talks with kind of a so what. Why should we care? I mean, it's a railroad. It's it's maybe interesting looking, but why does this Metropolitan Line, which is essentially the railroad line that runs from Washington D.C. right up through our part of the Ag Reserve up to Point of Rocks in Maryland, why does that matter? What is its significance? When this line opened in the 1870s, you really have to consider just how rural the county was, especially the upper part of the county that we now refer to as the Ag Reserve. It really changed the speed at which we could move people and goods from one location to another, from farmland to markets, from homes into the city. And so what happens is when this rail line opens up, it takes travel times and drops them significantly. So prior to the 1870s, my understanding is that a trip from Rockville to DC could take around 8 hours, just given the state of the roads and the relative lack of transportation. Once this railroad line came into service, that trip could be done in around 45 minutes. So it really kind of changed the possibilities for people throughout the county. In the northern part of the county, where I am up here in the ag reserve, where most of you are, I think, it opened up a lot of opportunities for farmers. In fact, you could probably make a pretty good argument that the ag reserve would not exist today, or at least it certainly wouldn't look the way it looks today, if the Metropolitan line had not come through. Because what it did was, not only did it provide, you can see the quote there from Montgomery Sentinel, but provide fertilizer and some of the equipment and various aspects of farming to farmers that allowed them to increase their crop yields. But it also allowed them to diversify the crops they were growing. You know, prior to the 1870s, everyone up here was primarily growing wheat and corn. And that was because you weren't on such a tight timetable to get that crop to the market. You could take some time. So if you're going to use the C&O Canal or the roads, which took a lot of time, you had that luxury because of these crops. But when the railroad came through, what it allowed us to do is to move goods quicker in markets. So things like perishables, essentially. So as a result, there's increasing use of and development of orchards up here, because we can get crops down into the markets in DC faster before they perish. Same thing with dairy farms. They start to spring up because we can move that perishable product down into the markets in DC. So it really changed the face of farming and agriculture up here in the northern part of the county. And then in the southern part of the county, kind of on the outskirts of DC, places now that we know as Kensington and Garrett Park and Tacoma Park, what it allowed was for essentially the beginning of subdivisions and kind of some suburban sprawl outside of the city. Now it was actually possible to commute. Prior to the 1870s, this idea of a commute to work was kind of a foreign concept that didn't really exist. You lived where you worked. The railroads, because of the speed that you could get into the city, it allowed people to change the way they lived their lives. It allowed them to live outside of the city and to commute into the city to their jobs on a daily basis. And so it really, really changed the shape of the entire county, both from a transportation standpoint, but also just from a cultural standpoint. So as I said, I'm certainly not an expert on this, and I just wanted to make one book recommendation. I have my own copy here, but this book, The Met by Susan Soderberg, who's a local historian. I actually had the pleasure to talk with her earlier this week before I jumped on here to talk with you all. But she wrote this book all about the Met, the Metropolitan Branch Line, a number of years ago. And it's a great resource. It's a great reference. I found myself reading it from front to back multiple times over because it had so much good information and is really well done. And so I would just say, as we go through some of this stuff, if you have increased interest and you want to dig deeper into kind of the story of the Metropolitan Branch, I would start here with Susan's book, because it's really, really well done. And you can find it right on Amazon, actually. Okay, so let's talk big picture first. So Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. So the B&O Railroad is, you can see this map, which is from 1876. And those really kind of bold, dark lines are the B&O Railroad and some of the branches coming off of it. And the first line that they built came in, and it was completed in the 1830s. And it was the B&O main line, which connected Baltimore out to Cumberland. And so as we zoom in here, this main line is kind of this line from Baltimore running out west and eventually stretching out to Ohio. The Metropolitan branch that we're going to talk about tonight that came later is this branch here that off of the main line here at Point of Rocks and then connects down to Washington. It kind of travels the course of the Potomac River, much like the C&O Canal, which was a big issue. The C&O Canal had just opened in the 1830s itself, and I'm sure many of you are aware of kind of the battle there between the C&O Canal and its ability to ship goods down the Potomac, and the railroad coming along, allowing us to move goods much faster. When this Metropolitan line opens up in the 1870s, it really signaled the start of the end for the C&O Canal, because we could essentially move goods along the same path much, much faster than the canal was able to do. So there was interest as early as the 1850s in creating a branch off of the B&O main line. Again, that's that line that ran from Baltimore out to Cumberland and onwards to Ohio. There's this interest in connecting that branch down to DC. As early as the 1850s, a number of businessmen created a small organization. They secured a corporate charter, which was essentially just a legal authorization to start exploring the land, to scout out and do some surveys on where that railroad branch might go. And they conducted a number of surveys. You can see one of them, one of the maps made from some surveys in the early 1850s is here in the picture. And what's interesting about this is, so the railroad line is kind of that dark black line. It's kind of snaking through the center up to the top right part of the screen. And you can see the survey and how it runs really, really close to Barnesville. And it's close to where the current tracks ended up. But actually the tracks today run on this picture below Barnesville, which is to the west of Barnesville, right? So this is an example of an early survey, but that is not the final plan of where the tracks actually went. And what happened was this, this company has this corporate charter, and I think it lasts for, it was good for 10 years. They had money issues throughout the time to actually build the railroad. And then something really significant happened in 1861, which was the Civil War starts. And at that point, there's zero appetite for doing construction through here, especially because, as we've talked about before, this part of the country had plenty of, troop movements and Civil War activity. So no one's too keen on starting a new construction project right in the middle of this active combat zone. So 10 years, during the Civil War, this company's corporate charter expires. So they no longer have the right to continue survey. And nobody really wants to do much during the Civil War anyways. But once the Civil War ends in 1865, the B&O Railroad, and I think there was a real recognition during the Civil War at just how significant railroads could be. Is a very significant line of what we call a line of communication in the military. It's a line to move troops and personnel and materials. Really showed its value during the war. And so after the war, my impression is that there was just an increased kind of understanding that the railroad was probably something that needed to be really expanded across the country, because it enabled so much greater speed in transportation. So the B&O takes over this charter in 1865. They start to scout out where they might want to create this metropolitan line. They begin constructing the line in 1866. And then on April 30th, 1873, the metropolitan line opens up. I know you can't read these articles, and I just have the first line from the left, the article on the left up top in the title here, just because I love the way that they wrote it. The line opens in April. Technically, it's completed, and everybody, based on looking at Sentinel articles from those weeks right after it was open, everybody's so excited. They've been watching this construction for years, and now the line is open. And so they the public is just waiting to be able to get on these trains to check this out. And there's this delay of a number of weeks, and you can see each weekly edition of the Sentinel, the writer is getting more and more frustrated that, like, hey, the tracks are complete. What's taking place? And so finally, a month after the tracks are complete and the trains actually start running, and they're commuter trains and people are using them, everybody's happy. But he starts this article by saying, well, the Metropolitan Branch is at last complete, and regular passenger trains have commenced running. Okay, so when we kind of zoom in further on the Ag Reserve, because that's really what I like to focus on, and we look at the metropolitan line of the B&O in the Ag Reserve, it's really only a 9-mile stretch that we're talking about, right? Kind of, you look at the map here, it comes into the Ag Reserve into Montgomery County, crosses the line right at the Monocacy River. So if you've been to the Monocacy Aqueduct and you're standing there, you can see that big, it's the Monocacy Trestle Bridge. I'll show you a picture of it in a second. That's essentially where the Metropolitan line is crossing into the Agricultural Reserve, runs through Dickerson, down through Barnesville, down through Boyd's, and then exit, as it continues to go further down county, it exits the Agricultural Reserve. So it's really just this 9-mile segment that honestly I'm kind of interested in and spent time looking at. And you can see here, I know it's not a great picture, but this is the Hopkins Atlas from 1879. And you can see kind of the Metropolitan Branch laid out here, running up from Monocacy down through Dickerson, all the way down here to Boyd's at the bottom of the page. So let's talk about Dickerson. So Dickerson Station, this is one of it's the westernmost station in Montgomery County. It's also, I guess, the northernmost station on the Metropolitan line in Montgomery County. I don't know how many of you actually have been out there to Dickerson Station. I'm ashamed to admit, but I took this picture on Sunday night, and that was the first time I've ever really stopped at the Dickerson train tracks. I've driven under them a billion times on my way to Frederick or wherever, but it's a really cool little train station and train stop there. But this little train station is actually quite significant. It's one of the few remaining original train stations built in 1891. It was largely burned down in the 1980s due to vandals, but rebuilt using the initial plans. But what is really significant about this structure, it's very, very small, but it was designed by the architect E. Francis Baldwin. And E. Francis Baldwin was a pretty renowned architect. He was from Baltimore, built a number of buildings and designed a number of buildings throughout Baltimore. In fact, when I was talking to Susan Soderberg the other day about Baldwin, she made a comment that she was talking to some architectural historians, and they said that, I think they were joking, but you could walk from one end of Baltimore to the other on the roofs of just Baldwin structures, because that's how many structures he was responsible for designing in the city, which is interesting. But he really got his claim of fame for his work on train stations throughout the country and on Catholic churches, which he also built throughout the country, and actually did a lot of development and design work on some of the architecture at Catholic University in DC. And what's really cool is that a lot of his work at these train stations is featured throughout this Metropolitan line. And I don't know if it was his most famous work, but I think it's going to be after this year. But the Point of Rocks station, really, really beautiful brick building built in the 1890s, developed or designed by Baldwin. But it's on the new stamps that just came out. So you could actually, I don't know if they're at the Poolesville post office, but you could go pick up your stamps, and the Metropolitan line is featured on those stamps right now through Point of Rocks, which is pretty cool. So I would assume that moving forward, this will be one of those buildings that when people talk about Baldwin's work, this will be one of the buildings they talk about first. So a couple of other interesting things about Dickerson. These are personal fascination points for me, but this home, the Hayes Dillonardo home, I think I've talked with you all about this in the past, but it's a brick home. It's built in the 1880s. It's built by the Hayes family, and the Hayes family is actually from Barnesville, and they were running a store up there in Barnesville. And my understanding is that Barnesville was one of the more populated areas, which I know is hard to believe because Barnesville is not very populated, but Dickerson was essentially just a crossroads when the railroad came through in the 1870s. There was nothing there. There was 2 or 3 structures. And Richard Poole Hayes recognized an opportunity that, hey, you know, there's this new train coming through. There's a new train stop in Dickerson. That's a pretty good reason to start a business down at that station and build a home. And so he builds this home in the 1880s. It's said that they transported the stone and the brick and the timber all the way from Barnesville on a horse-drawn buggy all the way down here to do it. It's a beautiful, beautiful home. It sits right next to the train tracks. And the Dillonardo family has owned and lived in the home since the 1950s. It's been passed down to, I think, 2 or 3 generations there. And I've spoken with them, and they talk about, they don't even notice the train anymore because they've been living next to it for 70 years. But they have really interesting stories of train wrecks and small collisions and issues. But they took me deep into their backyard, which lines up right alongside of the railroad tracks there in Dickerson. And they showed me, I didn't get a great picture of it, kind of in the center, you can kind of see it, but there's this hill rising up here. And at the top of this hill is the train tracks. And what happened was there was kind of this little cut or valley. And in the 1870s, when they came through and built this part of the Metropolitan Branch, the engineers had an option. They could either build a bridge over this cut, or they could fill it with dirt underneath and just turn it into kind of a man-made hill that the tracks could sit on top of. And they, for whatever reason, decided to go that direction. But there was a stream running through the bottom of this cut. And so what they had to do was essentially build this culvert. And so there's this culvert out in the middle of the woods running under the tracks. And it's you can walk through it. I wouldn't, and I didn't. My kids probably would. But you know, it's been there since the 1870s, just kind of tucked away, and it connects the farmland on the other side of the tracks. To the bottom left here, very close to this culvert, actually, is this this pipe that I you know, is described to me as a spring. I'm not sure if that's the case or what, but it's always been flowing. And allegedly, when the men were building the railroad tracks here, this is where they would hang out and fill up their canteens and eat their lunch as they were kind of completing this portion of the tracks in the Dickerson area, which is kind of cool. The other big thing, and this was something that I had never ever heard about before, and I always love learning new things about the Ag Reserve that are significant. But there, you know, the Metropolitan Branch has had a number of significant crashes, train wrecks, since it was built. One of, not the most significant, but one of the most significant crashes took place in 1942 in Dickerson. In fact, very, very close to where I was just showing you that picture. What happens is, and I took this picture on Sunday as well. And this is, if you're ever driving out to the Monocacy Aqueduct, you go over a little bridge, and below you is the train tracks. And this is kind of standing on that bridge, looking down. This is going towards Dickerson. So this turn here is really significant that you see in the picture, because what happens in 1942 is that a train bringing passengers down to DC, on the other side of this turn towards Dickerson, has some type of air compressor issue, and it stops and it needs to be fixed. And you can imagine, you know, in the 1940s, there are some signaling mechanisms to other trains, but they're relatively rudimentary. And basically what they do is when this train stops, they have a signal man with the flag, and he gets off the train and runs back up here to try to signal any other trains that that are coming to slow down because there's a train stopped ahead. They fix their air compressor problem. The signal man runs back to get onto the train. It's supposedly very, very foggy, and they start to move, but I suppose they're moving very slow. And another train moving on this track towards Dickerson comes up and hits them in the rear, going around 45 miles an hour. So, it was, you know, it's not, that's bad. It's not great, but it was not a terrible crash at that point. But what happened was when those two trains made contact, that lead train became derailed, and some of the cars slid over onto the other tracks. And they slid over onto these other tracks at the exact same time that a freight train leaving Dickerson was coming up this way towards us in the picture. And it slammed into that car, causing a really significant fire, and just a complete mess of wreckage and flames and metal everywhere. And the problem, if you've ever been to this part of the ag reserve or I mean, this is in the middle of nowhere. And you can imagine in the 1940s, it was even more remote. It was very, very, very difficult to get rescue crews and, you know, firemen and police and everything else needed to respond to this incident onto the tracks to rescue these people. And so 14 people end up being killed right here, right on the outskirts of Dickerson in this train wreck. Made national news, caused some changes in the way that trains use signal mechanisms. And, you know, just obviously a really terrible incident that I had never heard about. I talked about it. Jack Toomey sent me a note and mentioned that he had done an article in the Monocacy Monocle about it, which I read and was really well done, but I hadn't heard about it before. So kind of an interesting event in ag reserve history here that made itself aware to me just from digging into this. The other interesting thing here, and I get in trouble every time I talk about this publicly, so I'm sure I'll get an email about it, but I just find it so fascinating that I can't help myself. The Dickerson Quarry. So, you know, a space of, or you know, an old swimming hole of lore, I suppose, we've talked about before in these talks, but it's a quarry that was really two quarries, but they were opened up just outside of Dickerson in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And they were pulling stone out of these quarries to actually make curbs down in DC. And I'd always wondered, you know, how did they decide where to put those quarries? Why did they put them where they put them outside of Dickerson? And then as I was doing research for the Metropolitan Line, you know, I started to think about some of these decisions people were making with putting structures and homes and businesses close to the tracks. I started to think like, oh, well, maybe they were thinking, put it close to the tracks, and that way you can move the stone down on the Metropolitan Line. And then going back and looking at some maps from the 1920s, came across this one map that actually shows that there had been, or at least there had planned to been, I don't know if it actually existed, a small branch that actually came off the Metropolitan Line out into the outskirts of Dickerson, which is essentially it goes right to the quarry. And so my guess is that they probably use this to move stone up to the main line and then down to DC. Those tracks are, if they ever existed, they are long, long gone, and there's not a single trace of them. But it kind of solves a little bit of a mystery for me of something I've always wondered about. As we can, you know, as mentioning earlier, crossing into the ag reserve, if you ever go out to the Monocacy Aqueduct, there's this Monocacy Trestle train bridge that you can see. And it's sitting on the Monocacy Aqueduct is a really cool vantage point to watch the trains go by. I mean, you can see from this trestle bridge, it's an amazing engineering feat when you consider this was built in the 1870s to be able to elevate trains this high over the surface of the water for that amount of distance. it's also interesting just to kind of think about, this is really that point where the C&O Canal and the train tracks are running right next to each other, within eyesight of each other, and they were, as I was mentioning earlier, big competitors in the standpoint of competing to get goods into DC and out into Western Maryland. Obviously, the train tracks eventually won out. We don't have any boats on the C&O Canal any longer, but we still have plenty of trains running up and down the Metropolitan line. So if you're ever out there, you can stop and wait and watch the trains come across there. And then the other interesting kind of bridge type structure is the Little Monocacy Viaduct. This one is more out of the way, but if any of you on here have never actually gone out to see this in person, I really can't recommend it enough. I think it's one of those really little hidden gems here in this part of the Ag Reserve. It's out. So if you're in Dickerson, instead of going to, I'm trying to remind myself of what the name of the road is, but instead of going out the road that you would use to go to the aqueduct, you go the other way on that road. And the road goes right underneath this Little Monocacy Viaduct. It kind of ends at a dead end after this into a bunch of driveways, but you can drive right under it. And the reason that I strongly recommend you go out there, and I would bring your kids to or grandchildren, is pictures don't do it justice for how huge this structure is. And this one was completed in the early 1900s, around 1906. So I'm not completely sure. This is something that Susan and I talked about. I'm not completely sure what the bridging mechanism was from the 1870s until 1906 when the line first came in. It was probably some type of wooden trestle bridge. But you can imagine that this took a significant amount of labor and time to put in place, and is very much still in use on a daily basis. But really, you should drive down there because you can drive right under and walk right underneath these arches, and it's really amazing to look up at them just to see how high off the ground this is and just how imposing the structure is. So Barnesville, the Barnesville station is really not in Barnesville. The Barnesville station is actually in a little crossroads that historically has been referred to as Selman, because the Selman family was the owners of that property. But you can see in the early 1900s here, this picture of Barnesville Station. And this is not, if you ever stop at the Barnesville Station now for the MARC train, this is not the building that you would see there now. This building, my understanding is it fell into kind of disrepair in the I want to say 1940s or 50s. And what they ended up doing was there was a pump house in Rockville that was built in the 1920s, and they actually moved that house from Rockville out to Barnesville to serve as the station. So that's what you see that's standing there now. The structure there is from the 1920s. But obviously, like you can imagine, Selman now, I mean, at the height of the railroad, actually had a bunch of storefronts, more homes in that area. Right now, it's really, you just kind of go down that hill under the tracks before you go up the hill into Barnesville. But during its heyday, there was much more of kind of a bustling little village right there at the tracks. That's no longer really the case. And then Boyd's, another one of these original Metropolitan line stations, and Boyd's as kind of a village and as a train stop is interesting because it's described in some of the historical documents as kind of like the furthest that most people were willing to take the train on the weekends. And so what would happen is you've got these, people in DC, especially wealthy individuals in DC, and they want to get out of the city for the weekends. And so they would jump on the Metropolitan branch and take it up to different stations. And Boyd's was, really, really far out there at this point. And so what happened in Boyd's is a bunch of A bunch of summer homes sprung up, a bunch of kind of resort type places sprung up, hotels for people to stay at. So it almost started as saying it was a resort town, I think is probably a little bit too strong of a statement, but it was a place that people came to kind of hang out for the weekends and get out of the city. And I can't talk about Boyd's and the railroad without talking about Winterbourne. So Winterbourne, I think I've talked about before, but this was built in the 1880s by the Totten family. Totten family was very, very wealthy. There was a Senator Totten, and then there was a bunch of prominent business people in the DC area with the Totten name. I believe Fort Totten is potentially linked to that family, but the Totten family in the 1880s were one of those wealthy families that decided to jump on the Metropolitan train and take it out to Boyd's. And they saw this land out here. They thought it was beautiful and it provided this nice kind of time away from the city. And they purchased a parcel of land right on the train tracks, right off the train tracks. And they built this home, Winterbourne. When it was built, absolutely gorgeous, beautiful home. The Tottens had so Denise is mentioning that it's being rebuilt. Yes, stand by. I'm going to show you that in 1 second. The Tottens had a bunch of unfortunate accidents here. They had 3 children. All 3 of them had I think they had polio. They had a grandchild that died sliding down the banister of the stairs. My impression of reading the history of the place was that initially it was quite grand. People would jump on the train to come up for these very elaborate and ornate dinner parties here at the Tottens residence. But over time, this place kind of became just almost like a painful place for them. The real death knell for this home happened in the 1920s. What happened was and this is something I hadn't mentioned previously, but when the Metropolitan line was first built, it was just a single track. And over time, there was a recognition that it would be way, way more efficient and useful to have a second track, so double tracked. The 1920s, they came through the Metropolitan line and they added the second track. And as you can imagine, really that created some challenges across the entire Metropolitan branch, because now what happens is you've got a bunch of buildings and stations and homes that are right up on the railroad line. And when you expand it, there's in some places not a whole lot of room to expand. So what happens here with Winterbourne is when they build this second line, what it does is it basically cuts this bridge that they were using as part of kind of their driveway. It destroys that. And it essentially cuts off access to the home, makes it much more difficult to access. And at that point, it was, passed out of the family. It clearly over time, had a couple of owners. It fell into really, really bad shape here over the last 30 or 40 years. If you go on YouTube and look up this home, there's a drone video of a drone flying through this place. It's a spooky looking place, right? Has a really positive current story. Individuals from down county who I've become friends with have purchased the home, and they are in the process of completely rebuilding it. So this is what it looks like as of about a month ago. You can see, it's almost a complete rebuild, but they are rebuilding it in trying to use the original plans, right? So they are wonderful homeowners. They had to do a whole lot of battles with different people in this area to just get access to this property and to officially purchase it. It's been quite a fight, but they are doing everything they can to bring it back to its original shape, which is just really amazing. And that's a good segue for me to say that I'm doing another home tour on May 20th. I'm hoping you all will join me. If this, if this looks interesting and cool to you, it's on the tour. So the homeowners that are, reconstructing it, they said absolutely, they'd love to have it on the tour. They'd love people to come see it and see all the work they're doing on it. That home, in addition to a couple of others that we've talked about before. So there's Mount Ephraim, which is up kind of above Dickerson, beautiful property from the 1860s. Solomon Simpson Plantation, which has been on the tour before, but just an incredible property. So there's kind of the old stone section from the 1750s, and then the newer section from the 1890s. We have the Trundle Barn, which is on Martinsburg Road. It's a big old stone barn. It looks like it's going to fall down any minute now. I want to make sure everybody sees it before it does that. No, we're working to get some funding to get that secured. Lindenwood Farm, for those of you who know Claire Howard, the artist who does incredible paintings, that's her and her husband's farm that's been on the tour before. Absolutely beautiful place. And then first time on the tour is Darnall Place, which is a really just incredible property from the late 1700s that I haven't had on the tour before, but really good friends of mine now own it. And so it's going to be completely opened up, and it'll be a really, really cool place to visit. So, okay, with that, I will go to questions.
Kenny, I put in the chat that the name of that road, I believe, is Monocacy Bottom Road that you were trying to think of. I'm pretty sure. I had a friend that lived out there. I'm pretty sure that's the name of it.
Okay. Yeah, it might be.
What part of Boyd's is Winterbourne in? Where is that?
Yeah, so it is it's funny because when you actually go to the driveway, you're going to be amazed because you've driven by it a billion times, but it's way back. If you know where like the train tracks kind of go over the road right there at there's like that intersection with the light down there, right before you were to go over the bridge over the man-made, that big lake. Yeah, corner of Clopper and Clarksburg Road. It's there's a little kind of nondescript driveway that goes back into the woods. There's like a swing arm gate there, and that's how you access it. The thing that's interesting to remember is that huge lake is man-made, and it's not even that old of a lake. It's massive, but it's not that old. And so when that home was built, it didn't back up to a lake. It was just farmland behind it. But now it has a large lake behind it.
And there's a railroad line that runs down to the power plant there in Dickerson. Is that the main line that runs through that part?
That's a small branch off the metro line. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. I know exactly what you're talking about. I'm trying to think of where it connects in, but it's right up there around the Monocacy Aqueduct that it links up with the Metropolitan branch. But yeah, it goes down into there, and I think I don't know how much it's used now. I know for a long time that's what they used to get coal in and out of the plant. But.
Right.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I want to thank you, Kenny, for coming again. It's always a pleasure having you with us. And thank you all for coming to view the presentation. So we hope you had a great time. And feel free to email us with any questions to info@poolesvilleseniors.com.